Welcome to Berkeley lecture series or گفتارهای Berkeley, and thank you for following up on our series of lectures. Our guest speakers today, we're happy to invite Dr. Kamran Matin today, and I invite you to follow up on future lectures by checking our website. Kamran Matin is an associate professor of international relations at Sussex University, UK, where he teaches international history, nationalism, and Middle East politics. His current research focuses on the theory of uneven and combined development, nation-state formation, nationalism, and the limits of political critique, post-colonial critique, the limits of post-colonial critique. He is the author of Recasting Iranian Modernity, International Relations and Social Change in 2013, the book published in 2013, and numerous articles and op-eds on Kurdish and Iranian politics, and the co-editor of Historical Sociology and World History, Uneven and Combined Development over the Long Durée. This book was published in 2016. And he's also the director of Center for Advanced International Theory, or CAIT. I'm very happy to invite Dr. Matin for this very timely and very interesting discussion. Dr. Matin, we're so looking forward to hear your discussion.
Thank you very much, Sharara. Thanks for this kind introduction. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's a great pleasure and privilege to deliver this lecture as part of the Berkeley lecture series. It's not a great start to begin a talk with apologies, but I want to apologize for the fact that I was not able to work on this talk over the last 10 days or so, which I had originally planned. There was some family emergency. So what I'm doing today is basically using a slightly modified version of a talk which I delivered back in April at the University of Toronto as part of a conference called Unfinished Revolutions. If there isn't the level of coherence you would expect, that's the reason, and I'm very sorry for that, but I try to be as coherent as possible. A second apology is more intellectual in nature, and that's to do with the fact that in such a short time, I cannot really do justice to the richness of Marxist tradition of theorizing nationalism and nation. There is a huge amount of work, and I pretty much skip over a lot of it. I focus on Marx himself as the abstract of the talk has indicated. In terms of some context or contextualization of the lecture, I would make some remarks regarding the personal, the political, and the intellectual aspects of the talk. I think the personal aspect is important because, thanks to the feminist and post-colonial literature over the recent decades, we are bound to, or is incumbent upon us to define our subject position. So I come from a Kurdish background. I grew up in the post-revolutionary Iran. I experienced Kurdish movement firsthand, and I grew up in a quite radical leftist environment. And for those reasons, the link between Iranian left and much later the Marxism as a social theory with the question of nationalism and nation formation has been quite important for me, both in terms of my own experience, but also in terms of my subsequent intellectual development and also academic work. Politically, I think it's goes without saying how important the question of nationalities or national question in Iran is. Although, as you will see in a minute, the immediate kind of trigger for my talk and the works I have done in this regard in recent months and year was Janjian Azadi, Women, Life, Freedom movement, and the way in which the question of Kurdish movement quickly became central to a quite, to put it mildly, intensive contestation within the movement and also within the Iranian opposition more generally. So while I begin from this, I believe that the question of nations or nationalities within Iran is an absolutely strategic and important question, one which kind of Iranian left, which is my main interlocutor in this talk, has historically engaged with, despite all the limitations, which some of which will become apparent in the course of my talk. But largely in recent decades, especially after the end of the Cold War, the relation has become more of a kind of negative relation in terms of opposing it on the grounds of its being divisive, or the common accusation of separatism and so on and so forth. As it will become clear in the talk, especially in the last part, I believe that if the left in Iran has any prospect of meaningful impact, it will require a much more sober, realistic, and serious engagement with the question of nationalities in Iran. And I think part of this requires a much more critical reflection and interaction and engagement with theoretical sources within Marxism itself. The conundrum of nationalism within Marxism has a long history, and there is a very rich tradition of thought, starting from Marx and Engels themselves, to Kautsky, to Otto Bauer, to Rosa Luxemburg, to Lenin, Poulantzas, and many more. And what I often witness in leftist texts or interventions within political discourse in Iran is a general obliviousness to this tradition, whether it's through neglect or ignorance, I don't know, but whatever the reason is, I think it has to be kind of dealt with. And finally, intellectually, I think nationalism is, has been a theoretical Achilles heel of Marxism, and this is not something I sort of come up with. Prominent Marxists such as Tom Nairn, who has been a great influence on my work, wrote in his classic book, The Break of Britain, that the theory of nationalism is Marxism's great historical failure. And I think this failure, unfortunately, has not been systematically overcome since he wrote those lines in 1970s. So the personal and political aside, I think my focus is more on this intellectual dimension of the topic, but I think towards the end, I will try, if I have still time left, to link the intellectual argument to the political dimension with respect to Iran specifically. Actually, there is one more point about the intellectual significance of this topic and the way in which I try to engage with it, and that is, I am located in a disciplinary space. I'm an international relations scholar. Iranian studies, as you know, is a branch of area studies. And there is this historical division of labor within social sciences, within which area studies are supposed to provide raw material, empirical data for disciplinary scholars to do the task, to undertake the task of theorization. There is a lot to be said on this, and I think this is inherently a colonial epistemic kind of arrangement. And in my work, I have tried to challenge this division of intellectual labor by actually try to provide theoretical thinking and reflection and intervention and contribution from within what is described as area studies. So rather than simply import theories from disciplines and apply them to our area, whether it's Iranian studies or Kurdish studies or Turkish studies, which are all part of the branches of area studies, I want to actually reverse this and show that how and why area studies can actually make a theoretical contribution. And in this particular talk is precisely the frame of my talk is to use the question of Kurdish movement in Iran and the attitude of Iranian left to it as a platform to engage with deep theoretical question within Marxist tradition and Marx's work himself. So, as you know, the Jinjian Azadi movement, Women Life Freedom movement, brought to the fore the national question, not least because of the fact that the strategic slogan, Jinjian Azadi itself, was a slogan which originated from within Kurdish movement. Despite that, very quickly, I think there was contestation around a particular element of this slogan, namely the freedom element. In Kurdistan and for the Kurds, at least for most of the Kurds, the freedom in women life freedom signifies not just individual freedoms and rights, which is something that is central to obviously liberal tradition of politics and political thought, but also collective, that is to say national freedoms and rights. So this collective conception of freedoms and individual conception of individualistic freedom, which is secured through citizenship rights, came into both a discursive as well as a political clash. And very quickly, what we witnessed was that there was a tacit alliance between various Iranian political tendencies, both left and right, against the notion of national self-determination right for the Kurds or other nations within Iran. For many Kurds, including myself, the position which right-wing forces, especially the monarchists, but also reformists within Iran, took against this element of the movement as well as the slogan was not surprising. These groups are obviously defined by their chauvinistic politics and their kind of Persian supremacist attitude to the very idea of Iranian nation, and this has been the case at least since early 20th century. But to see that some of the leftist activists and intellectuals also took a very hostile line against the Kurdish movement was disappointing, to say the least, because historically and especially prior to Iranian Revolution and in the first decade after revolution, at least, some of the important leftist groups in Iran, especially سازمان چریک‌های فدای خلق ایران and some other smaller leftist groups, did offer solidarity and support for Kurdish movement. I vividly remember how when the leftist groups in rest of Iran were under attack by the Islamic Republic, many members of these groups migrated to liberated zones in Kurdistan and continued their struggle against the Islamic Republic, so much so that Kurdistan was described by many of these groups as the last trench of revolution, آخرین سنگر انقلاب, as they called it. And yet, even at that period of time, as a recent work by Jahangir Mahmoudi and Rasmus Elling have demonstrated regarding سازمان چریک‌های فدای خلق, even their support at the time was rather qualified, and it was fraught with contradiction and inconsistencies. For example, the right of self-determination was always interpreted in a autonomous sense, rather than the right to secede and form of one's own national state. And this tensions over this question was one of the many reasons that led to the split within سازمان شرکت فدای خلق and the majority faction, which basically joined the Tudor party and supported the Islamic Republic explicitly against the Kurdish movement. But more recently, in the aftermath of the Xinjiang Azadi movement, we have seen texts by quite prominent and respected leftist intellectuals, people like Mohammad Reza Nikfar and Parviz Sadaqat, both of whom I respect and consider my friends. They have written texts which are extremely critical of Kurdish movement, and in essence is really hardly distinguishable from the right-wing forces position, that the Kurdish movement, and I'm talking about Kurdish movement obviously as my main case, but this applies to other national movements within Iran as well. So they have used kind of terminology such as qawm-garai, tribalism, separatism, particularism, and all of this used in an obviously normatively negative sense, that these are, by virtue of being particularistic, are actually have to be opposed. These works and those texts I mentioned have received responses from different quarters, from Kurdish feminists such as Sahar Baqeri or Shirin Kamangar. Even Somaia Rostanpour has written on the hostile attitude even of some of Iranian feminists towards the Kurdish movement. And my own position has a lot of obviously similarities with those arguments. But today, and in this talk at least, I want to trace the origins of this attitude to its intellectual roots within Marxism and Marx's thought in particular. Now, before doing that, I would say that a critical theoretical response to Iranian leftists' opposition to Kurdish movement's demand for national self-determination up to independence can be critiqued from different perspectives, other than or in addition to what I'm going to present later on. For example, their opposition to Kurdish national movement on the grounds that it's particular and divisive and ethnicist and so on is based upon the assumption of the existence of Iranian nation as the universal sort of form of identity. Now, anyone who has a rudimentary knowledge of modernist theories of nationalism would find this, highly problematic, if not laughable, because if nations are by definition particularistic phenomena, then that applies to Iranian nation too. So to argue against Kurdish movement on the ground that it's particular in relation to Iranian nation ignores the fact that Iranian nation itself, even if you accept its conception by those leftist intellectuals or anyone, itself is a particularity when it's contextualized within world politics or international relations. It is one of many nations in the world. So in that sense, it is particularistic itself, and therefore the critique can be turned against it. Moreover, their defense of Iranian nation as the frame of politics disregards the historical nature of that nation itself. And that is extremely un-Marxist, to say the least, because Marxism's claim to distinction within tradition of modern political and social thought is that it's utterly historical. It historicizes all phenomena, social phenomena in particular. So to take for granted the idea of Iranian nation as a sort of trans-historical or supra-historical phenomenon, it's a complete contradiction with the very basic premises of Marxism itself. And also you can adopt a post-colonial perspective and basically debunk this false universalism of Iranian nationalism versus the supposed particularism of Kurdish nationalism. Universal in what sense? For who? And therefore, we can quickly see that the very idea of universalism, which is used in these critiques of Kurdish movement by Iranian leftist intellectuals, is based on a false conception of universalism. And not only false, one which actually glosses over or neglects, or in fact forgets that that nation itself is based and constructed through immense violence committed against other non-Persian cultural communities in Iran. And there is obviously huge literature on that. So these are different ways in which those arguments can be countered and in fact demonstrated as being un-Marxist in the general sense of Marxism being basically a social theory which is based on historical materialism, which seeks to historicize social phenomena. But I want to suggest that actually the reason why these positions are adopted by Iranian leftist intellectuals is not that they don't necessarily know their Marxism, although in some cases that might be true. I want to argue that actually the problem lies, at least its roots lies in Marxist theory itself, and specifically in Marx himself and Marx's philosophical kind of assumptions. And in order to demonstrate that, I focus specifically on Marx's theory of alienation, which is articulated in particular in his so-called 1844 Paris manuscripts, or economic and philosophical manuscripts. And even though some Marxists, especially political Marxists, have argued that they distinguish between Marx's mature works like Grundrisse or Das Kapital, from his earlier works, including the Communist Manifesto and the Paris manuscripts, I agree with people like Henry Berkeley and other Marxists that actually there is no such a sharp break in Marxist thought. And in fact, Marx's basic philosophical premises and his basic philosophical worldview, if you like, is already articulated in Paris manuscripts, and it is, informs his mature work, including, Das Kapital. So in order to demonstrate this, I want to begin from Marx's famous thesis 11 on Feuerbach. I'm sure most of you or all of you are familiar with that particular thesis, in which Marx says, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So I want to ask, or maybe I would invite you to ask, why should we change it? Why should the world be changed in the way Marx asks us to do in that thesis 11? I think Marx's own answer is quite straightforward and simple. He would say that in a capitalistic world, social relations are antagonistic. A world based on private property, capitalist division of labor, extraction of surplus value, and so on, all of this involve antagonistic relations. And it is this antagonism, this contradiction, which is the fundamental reason why Marx opposes the world as it is and wants to change it in a kind of communistic direction. Now, we can go on and again ask why these social relations are antagonistic, why private property is antagonistic in Marx's view, why exploitation of workers through surplus value is antagonistic. At this point, actually, you can't find an answer in terms of scientific propositions in Marx's writings. For example, you don't find an answer to why private property is antagonistic by looking at the law of the falling rate of profit in Marx or in Capital, or through looking at his labor theory of value. Because actually both of these theories, in fact, assume that antagonism which we want an explanation for. So in order to understand actually why Marx believes the world of private property is antagonistic, we have to look at his fundamental assumptions. And these fundamental assumptions, as I mentioned, are particularly articulated in his Paris manuscripts, where he actually develops his theory of alienation. So when you look at that text, Marx says the world of private property in means of production is antagonistic because the laboring human being is alienated. He also uses the word estrangement. So what is alienation for Marx? Marx says alienation is man's, and man is his word. And of course, there is huge literature on Marx's 19th century kind of sexism and patriarchy and so on and so forth. You could replace it with humans to make it more kind of gender egalitarian, but I'm just using the words he uses in that text. So Marx says alienation is man's severance from other men. He's becoming a mere individual, a one-sided being with his private worries and concerns, private vices and virtues, isolated sorrows, and inwardly perceived happiness. These are Marx's words I'm quoting. So Marx says that the self-regarding individual of the capitalist world is alienated, is estranged. Sometimes Marx describes this alienation or estrangement through this very evocative phrase. Marx says that alienation makes man not at home. He says, in the world of capitalism, the man is not at home. Now, again, we can, or we should maybe ask, so where is man's true home for Marx? Where is this home in which man is no longer alienated? Marx's answer is actually quite explicit and clear. He says species. He says man is a species being. Now, what is species? Species is, in a very simple way, is the largest group of organisms in which any two individuals of the appropriate sexes or mating types can produce fertile offspring, typically by sexual reproduction. So species is the largest category of classification of organisms. So for Marx, the individualized person of capitalist world is alienated because it is delinked or removed or separated from his species being. In other words, man's true home for Marx is the entirety of mankind, or humanity, to make it less gender specific. So Marx says, again I quote, man is a species being because he treats himself as a universal and therefore a free being, a being that treats the species as its own essential being. But conditions in actual society, by which he means capitalist society, negates this. Estranged labor estranges the species from man. It turns for him the life of the species into a means of individual life. First, it estranges the life of the species and individual life, and secondly, it makes individual life in its abstract form the purpose of the life of the species, likewise in its abstract and estranged form. So for Marx, alienation from nature means estrangement of man from man. So in modern society, man is not only separated from his essence, that is to say the species, but also it's fragmented, it's broken up, it's crumbled, lost in a chaotic, hostile world of antagonistic productive relations. In this world, man is no longer a universal being, as he describes man as species being, but it's an individual, self-centered, a particular being with sectional, restricted group loyalties and allegiances. So for Marx, communism is the total and final negation of this negation. So if alienation of labor has alienated man from his true nature, i.e. from species, communism is the negation of that negation. In other words, communism cancels man's existence in capitalistic, individualistic wilderness. So Marx describes, therefore, communism as the complete return of man to himself as a social being, the true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. It is the positive transcendence of all estrangement, that is to say, the return of man from state to his human social mode of existence. So in other words, for Marx, actually, all particularistic vertical divisions, including state, tribe, religion, and so on, these are expressions of alienation, which separates man from his true world of species or social unit. Again, we have to ask, so what is the limits, what is the remit of this species being, this humanity, which Marx believes to be the real home of man, in which he is not alienated? Marx is quite emphatic about the essential oneness of man and his species. And in Paris manuscripts, he remains silent on horizontal divisions of humanity through nation or religion or race and so on and so forth. So for him, all these divisions and distinctions are historically produced through alienation, and in his ideal communist society, you have humanity as the single unit of social being. And part of this actually relates to the way in which Marx, again in Paris manuscripts, defines humanity as a species being in the way in which he defines it in relational terms by distinguishing it from animal species being. And the distinction between the two, of course, is consciousness. For Marx, human beings are distinguished from animals because of their consciousness and therefore will and reflexivity and so on. And in order to make this relational conception, he has to, logically speaking, to homogenize the humanity in order to make it comparable to the animals as a species being. So Marx actually begins from abstraction, from cultural, ethnic, national, racial diversity and plurality. And this is really a fundamental issue in Marxism, that for Marx, humanity is singular, it's unitary. And the fact that in real world, in the world in which he wrote about and lived in, there were multiple nations or races and so on. These were, in other words, there were aberrations, there were distractions, there were alienations from that ideal world of unity. I described, or obviously I haven't, but I follow those who have, that this in effect is a singular social ontology that underlies Marx's entire theoretical contributions. And the fact that he thinks of the social or the social world in ontologically singular is not just in Paris manuscripts, but also in his later work, especially in the German ideology, which is a very fundamental text in Marxism as a social theory. And I have discussed this in the concluding chapter of my book, Recasting Iranian Modernity, which Sharara mentioned in the introduction. There I show how Marx uses this singular conception of society in his, in his articulation of historical materialism. He says the production of life appears as a double relationship, on the one hand as natural, on the other as a social relationship. And he says similarly in Grundrisse that all production is appropriation of nature on the part of an individual within and through a specific form of society. So again, Marx doesn't talk about societies in plural. He talks about society. And I think here lies the root of the problem of nationalism for Marxism, because nationalism and any other form of horizontal division of humanity is an obstacle, is a problem to be explained and overcome. It's not seen as historical reflection of a fundamental quality of social world. And I think that's the problem. Because for Marx, departing from this premise, all other smaller entities such as state, the nation, the tribe, the family, and even class, ultimately these are obstacles between human beings and species. These are the barriers which separate man from his true species. In other words, man's true freedom and emancipation, or human emancipation for Marx, is when all of these have disappeared. And this is what also, this is how he, in the famous text on the Jewish question, Marx counterposes human emancipation to merely political emancipation, which bourgeois democratic state offers. Again, Marx always looks at his destination is a unitary humanity. And therefore, in political terms, whenever Marx and Engels encounter particular national questions or nationalist movements, their position is always dictated by the way in which they think that this national movement or this particular nation is paving the way for the transcendence of capitalism and therefore communism, reaching communism. So in so doing, they are quite Hegelian in the sense that for Hegel, only nations who form the state are historical, because for Hegel, ultimately freedom is obtained in the state. For Marx and Engels, freedom is achieved only truly in communism, and communism happens only after capitalism has matured. So in the era of capitalist development and emergence, anything which contributes to further capitalist development is positive, not because it's capitalistic, but because it's a precondition for communism which is to come. So if a national movement is facilitating the formation of a bourgeois state, and bourgeois state through centralization and complexification of division of labor contributes to the development of productive forces, which in turn brings about the eventual collapse of capitalism and therefore communism, this is a positive kind of phenomenon to be supported, which is why they supported, for example, Irish nationalism, but they opposed Slavic nationalisms. And moreover, because Marx, as I explained, departs from this mega unit of humanity, which is not differentiated within, Marxists have always had a bias towards larger political units, because the larger unit means a larger national market, a broader division of labor, and therefore a more vibrant and vigorous form of capitalist development, and therefore a more likely demise of capitalism and therefore communism. And I think this bias for larger units is also seen in the way in which, you know, Iranian leftists so kind of resolutely holding on to Iran as a nation state, forgetting that in so doing, actually, they are exercising or performing a very classical form of nationalism, which they condemn in others. I see that I have only maybe 5 minutes left. So if this argument which I have presented is plausible at all, then you might ask, so what's the solution? Well, I'm not one of those people who, you know, because of particular problems in Marxism, believes that it has to be basically thrown away in its entirety. I think Marx's critique of capital remains profoundly relevant and important. And we are lucky that actually within Marxist tradition, there are those, maybe very few, who have productively critiqued this singular ontology of Marx's, and also this economic determinism of subsequent Marxists, especially in the Second International, in the time of Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg and so on. People including, you know, especially Otto Bauer, but also Lenin himself. But the one Marxist intellectual, I think, who has provided the most radical solution to this problem is Leon Trotsky, even though he did not formulate it as such when he wrote. But I have used in my writings and in my research his idea of uneven and combined development. And I found that idea fundamentally different from Marx's fundamental premise of humanity as a single, undifferentiated kind of entity. Because in Trotsky's idea of uneven and combined development, the basic premise from which everything else then derived is unevenness. And by unevenness, we can understand multiplicity and plurality rather than simply difference in level of development. So when you begin from what I would describe as a plural social ontology, as opposed to a singular social ontology, then your theorization, but also your political interventions, would not be bound by the demands of that singularity from which you begin. So in my book, Recasting Iranian Modernity, towards the end, I argue that to solve this problem of ontological singularity in historical materialism, we have to reformulate the basic premise of historical materialism, which is double relationship for Marx, into what I describe as a triple relationship. For those of you who don't know German ideology, the text, Marx and Engels, who wrote together this book, they claim that, you know, if you want to understand any society or any social phenomenon, the fundamental premise you begin with is double relationship, by which they mean the way in which human beings engage with nature to produce their most fundamental necessities, food and shelter. So the double relationship is therefore, on the one hand, the relation of human beings to the nature, and also the relation between those human beings which engage with nature in collectives. Because no human being, individually reproduces himself or herself or themselves. Humans are inherently social beings, so the relation between those human beings in their interaction with nature is the second relationship. But as I have argued, this kind of argument assumes a single society rather than multiple societies, because it's true that human beings have to engage with nature in order to survive, but they don't do it in a singular form, in single collectivities. In a single collectivity, there are always more than one society which engages with nature. So the triple relationship I have argued for consists of relation of human beings to each other, to the nature, and relationship between multiple collectivities of human beings or societies. So rather than a double relationship, what we have in reality is a triple relationship. And once you have this kind of basic premise, then you can indeed have a historical materialist theory of nationalism, in which you can actually explain the modernity of nations and nationalism in terms of capitalism and the way in which capitalism, in its expansion geographically, is mediated by geopolitics and geopolitical fragmentation. I was hoping to be able to expand on this, but I see that that time is running out. So I hope that this might come up in the questions and answers, so I can address that. But what does this approach mean for Iranian politics, especially leftist politics, is that rather than seeing cultural and linguistic and national diversity as a problem which is solved by the ultimate socialist revolution, I think a perspective which is informed by uneven and combined development and based on that critical engagement with Marx and Marxism would show us that actually no progressive political change in Iran or anywhere, I would say, is possible without what feminists have described as an intersectional approach. In other words, capitalist exploitation is never happening outside of racial difference or gender difference or national difference. So there is no sequence. It's not that let's solve this bigger question of capitalism and then all these other ones will also be solved. This is what most leftists in the Middle East and elsewhere have always told the subordinate nations. Turkish communists or Iranian leftists tell the Kurds, wait, don't pursue a separate Kurdish politics. Once we have socialism, national question will be solved. the perspective I have developed here is that, in fact, there is no such a thing possible. No socialist revolution is possible without actually the agency of those subaltern nations. That any successful revolution in Iran, a kind of a socialist or a progressive revolution, cannot focus on only one kind of hierarchy, that is to say, class hierarchy. National hierarchy and gender hierarchy as crucial and constitutive of modern capitalism as class hierarchy. And this is why actually Jinjian Azadi was such a fundamental innovation and progression in democratic and progressive struggle, because that was the slogan and the movement which for the first time actually articulated the entanglement of these different hierarchies and told us that no emancipatory movement can eschew or ignore one of these hierarchies in favor of another. Neither gender hierarchy can be excluded in the struggle for socialism from class or vice versa, nor national hierarchies. So a hegemonic politics of the left has to come to terms with the fact that capitalism always already ethnicized, racialized, and based on gender hierarchy. There is no pre-national or pre-gender capitalism, and the other way around as well. I think I'll stop on that note, and I'm sorry I have taken up a few more minutes, but I hope that we can have a productive question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matin. Such a thought-provocative discussion, rarely discussed, I have to admit, and it takes courage, in my opinion, to start the conversation like that, which, you know, is really past due. And I'm really happy that we have the opportunity to hear you firsthand. We have two questions waiting to ask. I already have two questions, so I want to ask our audience to excuse me to, if I may, so pose my first question. Then I would read the other two questions, and if no one else asks question, I will leave my second question for last. Since your discussion, your critique of Marxism is how you focused your talk mostly on, and you brought up very, very interesting critique of Marxism. I have a question about your position in your book. I'm one of the people that I bought your book. I read some of it, not all, but there is a part at the very beginning in your introduction that you say this about Marxism. They have also been theoretically susceptible to Eurocentrism as a result of their conception of international relations. And my question, after what you said about Marxism and Marx himself and Engels, I wonder why you stay at that level to say it's susceptible to Eurocentrism. Why don't you go further and say Marxism, at least one of the problems with Marxism was it is a Eurocentric point of view. Marxism encourages Eurocentric view. Europe is the center of the world. And that kind of, everything else that you said is a different angle about the humanism, unity of society. Very, very interesting that the starting point, or at least the goal, seems to be Hegelian, right? We all aim at one ideal society. And in today's world, maybe that worked for 30 years ago, 40 years ago, intellectual mindset. But in today's world, I totally agree with you that our starting point should be pluralism, diversity. And then we judge other theories. And as one of the feminists, I was surprised to see some of the feminists you mentioned. I really appreciate if you could elaborate on those feminists who were critical of Kurdish self-determination position. But as you said, intersectionality is a very, very important guideline these days for not only feminists, but for all revolutionary progressive movements. So I'm happy to hear that you also see to give that value to that point of view. So I guess just go back to my question as about Marxism, whether or not you view it as being problematic because of Eurocentrism. Do you want to address that, or should I go ahead and read other questions as well? It's up to you.
Okay, I think I answered this very quickly because it's actually quite easy to answer. I mean, I think the susceptibility is more of a, I guess, stylistic difference between what you say and what I wanted to say, because I do, in the rest of the book and elsewhere, I describe Marxism as classical Marxism as Eurocentric. But I also make the point that I don't think Marxism, or specifically historical materialism, is irredeemably Eurocentric. In other words, I think Eurocentrism is not intrinsic to it. It can be reformed in a way that it retains some other really powerful explanatory power which it has without being Eurocentric. And also the quote you refer to is part of the book in which I try to explain why Marx was unable to produce a theory of capitalist expansion as opposed to a theory of capitalist development. Because he was writing at the time when capitalism had emerged in England and Western Europe, but it had not expanded to the rest of the world. So his theory of capitalist development was retroactive. He was looking at the history of England to have a theory of capitalist development. But because capitalism had not globalized yet, he had to actually, if you like, generalize from English experience as if it will happen everywhere in the same way. And that is where the Eurocentrism comes, because it assumes that different societies are at different levels or stages of development, and as they move forward, they would repeat the same process which England, as the birthplace of capitalism, has gone through. So in a way, he extrapolates from England. And that's where the Eurocentrism begins, because his concept of class, for example, concept of state, these are based on their fully formed versions in England. But what he doesn't see is that what happens when capitalism actually moves from this center to the rest of the world. And that's where the international dimension, for me at least, becomes very relevant, because capitalism is not simply diffusing around the world. It is refracted through pre-existing geopolitical fragmentation. And that has fundamental implication for the way in which capitalism in later societies emerges. So for example, German capitalism from the beginning was much more centralized, much more state-driven compared to the English one, because German capitalism was a response to English capitalism. Russian capitalism was even more centralized because it was a response to the pressure of German capitalism. And the degree to which state becomes implicated in capitalist development in later cases reshapes the very idea of capitalist, social relations in those countries, which is also why capitalism in a place like Iran is a rentier state and all that actually is very different from a classic liberal capitalist state in the way in which, for example, in Britain has taken shape. So yeah, I take your point. I think Marxism Marx himself was Eurocentric, but I think in the way in which I explained, I think it can be overcome without losing all the other positive elements of Marxism.
Thank you very much. Let me read the first question in English, which is in English. We have two other questions in Farsi. And I understand if the question is in Farsi, you're going to respond in Farsi.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. This question is anonymous. He or she asked, regarding the experience of nation-building project and Kurdish people's experience in 4 different countries in the Middle East, what are the similarities and differences of the Kurdish people during the nation-building in Iraq, Turkey, and Syria versus Iran? Thank you.
I think because Kurdistan was divided at the early 20th century, late 19th century onwards, different branches of Kurdish movement were shaped by the particular state against which they were struggling for national rights. So Kurds in Iran naturally were trying to achieve national recognition in relation to the Iranian state, and the Kurds in Turkey in relation to Turkish state, and so on. So actually the specificities of each of these states has impacted on the Kurdish movement in each state, which is why also Kurdish movement is different in different parts. It's different within the same part as well. You have right-wing Kurdish nationalists, you have left-wing ones, you have liberal ones, and so on, like any other society. But just as an example, in Iraq, for example, the level and depth of capitalist development in Kurdish regions was much less compared to what happened in Iran after land reforms during the Shah period. So in fact, one can explain why was Kurdish movement in Iran much more, socialist and secular oriented, as opposed to much more conservative and tribal form of nationalism in Iraq, which we see even today. And same goes for Turkey, because Turkish state's level of capitalist development was even more advanced than Iran in early 20th century onwards. The Kurdish movement against this centralized Turkish state from the beginning was much more leaning towards socialist tendencies, because capitalist social relations were already sort of undermined in a very significant way, pre-capitalist social relations and so on. And also each of these states' international relations affects the way in which Kurdish movement has acted historically. So for example, again, Turkey is a member of NATO. So if you are opposition to Turkish state, by definition, you will be opposed to NATO and therefore to American imperialism, and so on and so forth. If you are opposing post-revolutionary Islamic Republic of Iran, which is itself in contradiction and tension with the United States, it's likely that you will find yourself in international politics against that regime which is opposed by the Western powers. Or Baath regime in Iraq was very close to Soviet Union, and therefore opposition to that state was indirectly or sometimes directly supported by Western powers, not because they liked Kurdish movement, but because they disliked Baath regime as a Soviet satellite. So there are different ways in which this different states' situation has affected Kurdish political forces within them, which has to do both with historical developments, the form of capitalist development and so on, but also with the foreign relations of those states themselves.
Thank you. Very good. The next question is in Farsi. با تشکر فراوان از دکتر کامران متین برای این بحث خوب، سوال من اینه که به طور کلی جنبش‌های چپ در سراسر جهان به ویژه در سیاست کمرنگ شدن. این رو در آینده ایران چگونه می‌بینید؟
ممنون از این سوال. بله، این یک واقعیتیه که بعد از سقوط اتحاد شوروی، حالا سر این که خود اتحاد شوروی واقعا چقدر با اون ایدئال‌های کمونیستی متناسب بود، اینا بحث خب میشه زیاد کرد، ولی نفس این که یک مدل و سیستم سیاسی اجتماعی متفاوتی از سرمایه‌داری وجود داشت در اتحاد شوروی و بلاک شرق، خود به خود جنبش‌های چپگرا رو در بقیه دنیا، حتی اون جنبش‌هایی که علیه اتحاد شوروی بودن، یعنی مخالف اتحاد شوروی بودن، در همین ایران خودمون مثلا چریک‌های فدای خلق، در کردستان کومله، اینها در واقع در تضاد با حزب توده و اتحاد شوروی شکل گرفتن. اونا فکر می‌کردن شوروی سوسیال امپریالیسم و اینها، ولی نفس این که یک مدل، یک آلترناتیوی وجود داشت، به نوعی در واقع سیاست چپ رو زمینی‌تر می‌کرد و به نوعی این چشمانداز یک دنیای متفاوت رو واقعی‌تر می‌نمود. بعد از سقوط اتحاد شوروی این خیلی کمرنگ شد یا کلاً از بین رفت، اما در این حال من فکر می‌کنم یه چیز خیلی مثبتی داشت این سقوط. اون همین بود که مارکسیسم از زیر بار مارکسیسم روسی و به خصوص اون چیزی که حالا مارکسیسم لنینیسم مینامند، در واقع ایده های استالین و اینها، خب رهایی یافت و رگه های انتقادی تر مارکسیسم تونستن که بیشتر دیده بشن، بیشتر بتونن در به خصوص محافل اکادمیک توسعه پیدا بکنن و کار بکنن. ولی به لحاظ سیاسی من فکر میکنم تقریبا تمامی موارد شکست جنبش‌های سوسیالیستی در دوران جنگ سرد و حتی قبلش نهایتاً برمیگرده به همین نشنال کوئسشن، به مسئله ملی، و اینکه چطور سوسیالیست‌ها همیشه ناسیونالیسم رو دست کم گرفتن یا به غلط باهاش برخورد کردن و هیچ وقت نتونستن درک بکنن که همبستگی ملی و همبستگی طبقاتی هم شبیهن و هم متفاوتن. از این لحاظ مثلا وقت نشد من درباره اوتوباور صحبت کنم. کار اوتوباور در اوایل قرن 20 که بعداً خلاصه مارکسیستای دیگه همه اون رو مرتد خوندن و کارهاش در واقع رد شد، از جمله از طرف خود لنین، این بود که باور اتفاقاً نشون میده در کارش که در واقع به فارسی کم مشکل معادلش رو پیدا کردن، ولی اون میگه که همبستگی طبقاتی ناشی از common experience هست، تجربه مشترک، ولی همبستگی ملی ناشی از communal experience هست، یعنی یک تجربه‌ای که در سطح احساسی هم یک جور تجربه میشه و این هست که در واقع علیرغم تمامی تضادهای طبقاتی، طبقه کارگر همون ملت با طبقه بورژوای همون ملت وقتی که به روابط بیرونی اون ملت میرسه، خواسته ناخواسته دچار یعنی وارد یک سری همبستگی‌هایی میشن. یعنی اینطوری نیست که در هر شرایطی طبقه کارگر یک کشور به نفع طبقه کارگر یک کشور دیگه علیه بورژوازی خودش وارد جنگ بشه. من این ماجرا رو در اغلب لکچرها مجبور میشم بیان بکنم چون خیلی گویاست. وقتی که لنین در آلمان بود یا در سوئیس یادم نیست و خبر این اومد که سوسیال دموکرات‌های آلمان رأی دادن به لایحه جنگ دولت آلمان برای جنگ علیه روسیه تزاری، اینقدر شگفت زده شد که گفت اینو پلیس مخفی آلمان جعل کرده، هیچ سوسیالیستی نمیره به جنگ رأی بده. چرا؟ چون فرضش این بود که سوسیال دموکرات‌های آلمانی یا سوسیالیست‌های آلمانی بنا به تعریف باید با سوسیالیست‌ها و کارگران روسی همبستگی اعلام بکنن، نه با دولت خودشون. و ما اینو مدام می‌بینیم در موارد دیگه در همین ایران که بحثش شد در رابطه با جنبش‌های ملی که وجود داشته. در خود اتحاد شوروی شما مثلا کتاب The Soviet Century که اسم نویسندش من متاسفانه یادم نیست این لحظه، ولی اونجا نشون میده که این بحث‌های خیلی داغی و بعضا حتی خشمگینی بین استالین و لنین و تروتسکی در میگیره بر سر اینکه اتحاد شوروی سازمان سیاسیش باید چه باشه. آیا اتحاد داوطلبانه ملت هاست اونجوری که لنین و تروتسکی میگفتن، یا اونجوری که استالین با لحن دیپلماتیک میگفت که آره مثلا نوعی فدرالیسمی که نهایتاً در صدرش روس ها قرار می گرفتن و یک نوع سنترالیسم دموکراتیکی که حالا در سطح حزبی هم به هر حال ایجاد شده بود و می‌خواستن اینو ریپلیکیت کنن، به اصطلاح باستولید کنن در سطح سیاسی خود اتحاد شوروی. و پس برگردم به همون سوال، این کمرنگ شدن جنبش‌های چپ به نظر من ناشی از این یکی از دلایل مهمش ناشی از این مشکل درک مسئله ملت و ناسیونالیسم هست. به خصوص من فکر میکنم که مورد اوکراین خیلی جالب هست و بیانگر این هست که چطور بسیاری از چپ‌ها در اروپا مدافع روسیه هستند، در حالی که روسیه از سر یک کشورگشایی کاملا امپریالیستی وارد یک کشور دیگه شده، موجودیت ملی و تاریخی اون ملت رو نفی میکنه. ولی برای چپ‌های یوروسنتریک غرب و حتی در ایران، صرف این که اوکراین از طرف غرب حمایت میشه در این جنگ کافی هست برای اینکه اونها طرف روسیه رو بگیرن، با وجود اینکه روسیه دیگه خب اتحاد شوروی هم نیست که حالا بگیم اونجا بالاخره یک سیستم غیر سرمایه‌داری هست، مترقی‌تر هست، پس بهتره که گسترش پیدا بکنه. روسیه هم یک نوع از سرمایه‌داری، تازه بدترین نوع سرمایه‌داری هست، چون آزادی‌های لیبرالی و بورژوا دموکراتیک هم در اونجا تازه وجود نداره. یعنی معلوم نیست که بر چه اساسی مثلا روسیه در این جنگ خاص عنصر مترقی و پروگرسیو تلقی میشه که باید در مقابل به اصطلاح اونها ناتو ازش حمایت بشه. این ناشی از اینه که اونها اصولا، من نهایتا فکر میکنم که همون بحث ملی و مسئله ملی و ناسیونالیسم براشون، برای اون دسته از مارکسیستا هنوز در واقع یک نوع مزاحمت، یک نوع مشکله که باید به نوعی دورش بزنن. همیشه در رابطه با اون چیزی که اونها در واقع greater good به قول معروف، اون پروژه بزرگتر مینامن، باید قربانی بشه. greater good مثلا تضعیف امپریالیسم هست یا سوسیالیسم هست و همه این مبارزات پایینتر باید در واقع به نوعی به خدمت این مبارزه بزرگتر در بیاد.
کاملا. به عنوان یک فمینیست آقای متین، من این تجربه زنای ایران رو میتونیم مقایسه بکنیم. من فکر میکنم که در انقلاب 57 حتی چپای ما و روشنفکرای ما خیلی براشون راحت بود که حقوق زنها فدا بشه برای اون گریدر گود که شما گفتید و انقلاب بشه، بعد مسئله زنها حل میشه. این فقط متاسفانه بین اسلامی‌ها نبود، در بین نیروی انقلابی چپ هم. سوال بعدی با اجازهتون میگم، بازم به فارسی. متأخرترین از خانم مهتاب، متأخرترین نمونه این رویکرد خصمانه نسبت به حق خودمختاری کردها در فمینیست‌های ایرانی رو میتوان در مطلب نوشین احمدی خراسانی در نشریه انکار یافت، اگه درست مونده باشم.
بله دقیقاً این اشاره به اون سوال شما بود که گفتید اگه مثالی به نظر من میرسه. من اتفاقا همین مثال بود که به نظرم رسید و اون مطلب سمیه رستمپور که من اشاره کردم در نقد نظرات همین نویسنده بود که قبلا هم در مورد مسئله کرد در واقع به صورت انتقادی مطلب نوشته بودن.
لطف میکنید دوباره اسم خانم سمیه
رستمپور. من میتونم لینک اگه البته پیدا بکنم براتون میگذارم.
خیلی ممنون میشه. بعد تو میتونیم ما بعداً در وبسایت برکلی لکچر سریز بذاریم تو رابطه با صحبت. خیلی ممنون از خانم مهتاب که این اطلاعات با همه ما در میون گذاشتن. سوال بعد از آقای تورج، انگلیسی هست، میخونم براتون. It seems to me your solution to solve or bring to resolution the rights of other nationalities within Iranian society is Marxist ideology. مطلب همینجا ختم شده، فقط به نظرم
اون تیکه آخرش رو میتونی یک بار دیگه بخونید؟ ببخشید.
بله میگن که به نظر it seems to me your solution to solve or bring to resolution the rights of other nationalities within Iranian society is Marxist ideology.
Right. Well, I mean, I didn't provide a concrete solution in the Iranian case. I was talking quite at the general theoretical level. But as I explained, there is no single Marxism. I talked about Marx himself, but there are very different strands of Marxism. And as I explained, for example, Trotsky's Marxism is very different from Marx's own Marxism, even though he wouldn't describe it as such. But as I explained, he begins from plurality of social existence, not from singularity. And therefore, his entire theoretical interventions is quite different. from it. I think to the extent that I personally follow modernist theories of nationalism, and to the i.e. I believe nation is a modern phenomenon. It doesn't mean that cultural diversity did not exist before nations, but nation is a particularly modern form of articulation of cultural difference. So in order to have a theoretical understanding of nation and nationalism as modern phenomena, we have to have an understanding of how they are related to capitalism. And I think that's where Marxism becomes relevant, to the extent that Marxism ultimately is a theory of capital and capitalism. So there is a lot of stuff which is useful. My own work has shown that how a different theorization of capitalist expansion as opposed to its initial development can provide a theory of nationalism which can explain its modernity without actually losing sight of pre-modern origins of nationalist movements. Every national movement always works on pre-existing material, right? Iranian nationalism invoked Persian language as the unifying force of the nation. The Kurds would say the same about Kurdish and so on. But they do so within a specifically capitalist context in which a modern state is trying to protect itself against external pressures for which it needs a national form, for which there is no capitalist social relations at hand, and therefore it relies on cultural forms as the basis of common identity. So in one of my articles, I show how, therefore, emergence of nation or nationalism in a pre-capitalist place like Iran or Kurdistan, for that matter, is explicable in terms of capitalism, but only if we have an international perspective on capitalist expansion, rather than looking for capitalism only within that particular society in which nationalism has emerged. Because in most cases, actually, you don't find capitalist relations at the time of nationalist ideology emerging. When Iranian nationalists in late 19th century, Mirza Agha Khan Kermani and others were talking about the Iranian nation, for example, there was no capitalism in Iran. You had basically merchants, as Marx would describe them as mercantile capital, but they were not capitalist in the classic sense of primitive accumulation has happened. There was no separation of producers from means of production. So the problem of most Marxists has been how to explain nationalism in terms of capitalism when there is no capitalism. But they have not seen any capitalism because they have looked at where the nationalism they were looking for emerged. So yeah, you cannot find capitalism in Iran in 1920, but capitalism did exist in England in 1920. It existed in France, in Germany. So once you have an international perspective for nationalism to emerge, you don't have to have capitalism right there in that particular society. It is the effect, it's a geopolitical effect of an external capitalism which generates a nationalist movement which is trying to form a modern state as a defense against external capitalist pressures. And because this happens in the absence of domestic capitalism, it has to rely on cultural forms. And of course, in the case of Iran, what would be the common kind of cultural element? They decided it has to be Persian because Persian has had a richer literature, has a longer history in written text and so on. And it was language of bureaucracy and the state for centuries. So it was chosen quite expressly for that purpose. If there was other consideration, it was quite possible actually that Iranian nationalism could be based on Turkish, for example. There is no logical kind of obstacle to that, which is why Scots speaking English or the Irish speaking English does not mean they are English. They are actually completely opposed to English cultural dominance. So common language in itself is not a sign of national unity, nor language difference in itself is a sign of national kind of division. It depends on how these different cultural communities are organized politically at the level of the state. And that's, I think, where the Iranian leftists, I think, fall short, because in order to have an equal political presence of these nationalities, the first step is to recognize them as such, because you don't enter into equal relations with someone who you do not recognize even existing, let alone equal to you. So that's why, for me, this discourse of qawm, ethnicity versus nation, is not only unscientific, it's also politically highly problematic, because it creates a hierarchy, right? Why is qawm inferior to nation? Why? It's just a colonial idea. Why a group of people would be inferior to another group of people? It's only because the other group has formed a state of its own and is able to actually describe the other as particular and describe itself as universal. So that's why I think the recognition of the other side as party to a contractual unity is fundamentally important in any solution to national question in a place like Iran.
Thank you very much. I believe we have to move faster because we have more questions now. Maziar Shirazi asked, what do you consider to be the most valid criticism offered by the left critiques you named earlier in your talk, Nikfar, etc.? And what is your response to those who oppose support for national movement, fearing balkanization of the IRI?
Yeah, I think that my main point would be that their premise is basically flawed. There is something called Iranian nation state, and if you pursue a policy which seeks to preserve it as it is, you are already an Iranian nationalist yourself. So you cannot actually criticize others for being nationalistic, because you are already nationalistic and you are already particularistic. Because if universalism is such a good thing, why not those leftists argue for dissolution of Iran and solution integration into Russia, for example? Why not? What's the problem? The bigger the better, right? So it's not true. So first of all, those leftists who claim this, they are already actually defending a nation state. So in that sense, they are nationalists. They are posing a universalism which is flawed because it's particularism. Iran is a particularity in the world, just in the same way that Kurdishness might be a particularity within Iran. But the more important thing is that particularity is not a negative thing in itself. It actually is a modernist bias, which Marxism has as well, that somehow the bigger the better, the progressive, the larger sort of the more the better in terms of that, that strategy. So that's the main problem. So actually my problem is much more intellectual than just the political, because it's just intellectually wrong. Their criticism is based on false assumptions. And also they cannot explain Iranian nation itself, because as a Marxist, you cannot say it's a metaphysical thing, right? Iranian nation has emerged at a particular time and place. How? You have to explain it how. So if you explain it and historicize it, you cannot deny the same process to someone else. They can have the same nation formation process just like you had. But in terms of balkanization, I think nationalism is something which, the more you ignore it, the more violent it becomes. It's something you have to actually recognize and encounter. There is no guarantee that if that recognition is given under certain circumstances, people may not decide to secede, and you have to be prepared for that. And interestingly, Lenin was absolutely adamant that right of self-determination has only one meaning, which is separation and formation of a separate state. for him, there was no such a thing as autonomy, federalism. You have to be able to separate. That's what the national self-determination means, which is quite tragic that Iranian left, which has so much, owes so much to the Russian Marxism, actually has forgotten the Leninist position. But I think, the Kurds are not blind to the fact that precisely because of the formation of Iranian nation state in the way in which it was, Kurdistan, just like Baluchistan and elsewhere, is being highly deliberately underdeveloped. So they know that even if they were allowed to form a state of their own, they may not actually solve many other problems. But the point is that they would not go down the route of a small, impoverished, independent state if they were assured that they can exercise national sovereignty within an existing political framework. Which is why I think Lenin was true. The only way to keep these nations together is for them to be able to actually, in legal terms, to secede. So, but once you provide equality and participation on equal footing, I just don't see why they would separate. Why do Scottish people decide not to separate, even though in some ways you could argue they are actually, I don't know, they have a very strong sense of national identity. So why they don't separate when they had a referendum? Because they calculate they are better off within this existing union. Maybe after Brexit, not so much, but up to now, they have benefited from it. So yes, there is no guarantee that Iran won't be fragmented if all these nationalities were recognized. But I can guarantee you that if they are not recognized, it's much more likely that Iran fragments. So a recognition which is accompanied by equal integration and participation is the only really effective way for preventing or preempting that kind of balkanization that person has asked about.
Thank you very much. If I may, I'm going to read questions faster, just to keep adding. خانم مهتاب گفتن کامنت من در جواب اشاره خانم شاهرخی درباره فمینیستایی بود که مخالف حق تعیین سرنوشت ملت‌های به حاشیه رانده شده هستند. خیلی ممنون خانم مهتاب، من تشکر کردم. پس سوال نبود، کامنت بود. Anonymous in English پرسیدن که some scholars draw parallels between Palestine and Kurdish nationalism experience. Is there such a parallel?
I think someone said, because we don't have a lot of time, maybe you can ask me more than one question, maybe two at each time. Sure. So I can address them because sometimes they are connected to each other.
Sure. So I go ahead and read the next one.
Yeah, please.
Murad Ruhi پرسیدن, thanks for this great talk. I have this question for Dr. Matin. I know the term Iran left, in quotation mark, is admittedly complex, given the significant divisions within the movement, much like other leftist groups worldwide. However, setting that aside, how would you evaluate the Iranian left's response to the issue of non-Persian nations in Iran during 1979, compared to their current stance on this issue?
Yes. Okay, thanks for this. Regarding Palestinian and Kurdish experience, I personally think fundamentally they are not different, because in some other works I have published or in the process of writing, actually I have, for me, colonialism does not need a force which comes from the overseas or somewhere else and takes up your land. Colonialism is when a force which is culturally foreign negates your sovereignty as a collectivity. So in that sense, China in Tibet is as colonialistic as Russia and Ukraine and Iran and Kurdistan, Iranian nation state, I mean. So to the extent that Kurdish collective self-rule is negated and denied by existing states which dominate Kurdistan, Kurds, I think, experiencing a colonial condition. Just because the colonialist has not come 5,000 kilometers from distance, it doesn't change anything. It's so foreign rule in the era of capitalism is called colonialism, and foreignness itself is a historical phenomenon. So it can change. What is foreign today may not be foreign tomorrow. I think it's political relation between cultural communities which turns one a foreign or even hostile community in relation to the other. So in fact, in the abstract for this talk, I have said, why is it that Iranian leftists are so easily and readily support Palestinian movement, which is a nationalist movement, but not the Kurdish movement? I think it's partly, again, goes back to the Eurocentrism, because many leftists, but also some post-colonialists, believe that colonialism is exclusive to the West. It's only the West which can colonize. Non-West cannot colonize, and it's simply not true. Japan in Korea in 1930s and 20s, Japan in Manchuria, Turkey and Kurdistan. I mean, there are a lot of cases where non-Western states practice colonial violence against non-Western peoples. But our categories, our concepts are based on European experience and somehow excludes those cases. And this becomes even more so when the state which is doing this itself is in a kind of in struggle against Western states, which is the case with Iran today, IRI. So yeah, I think in essence, Kurdish movement and Palestinian movement are similar to the extent that in both cases, collective self-governance is being prevented by an external foreign force, and that's the case in both cases. In terms of Murad's question, the Iranian left in the immediate aftermath of revolution 1979 and also before it, I think they were still quite influenced by the Soviet experience and also Leninist position on national question. And they offered support, but actually, if you read the literature from that time, and I highly recommend this book chapter by Jahangir Mahmoudi and Rasmus Elling on Sazman Chirikah Fadai Khalq in the few years after revolution, you see that while they support Kurdish national self-determination, they always draw a red line, which is separation. So they support it, but they are not prepared to accept a potential independent Kurdish state. And I think that has to do with all these problems I mentioned about Marx and Marxism, but also because at the time, dependency theory was extremely popular in the leftist world, as you know, and dependency theory was all based on, satellite versus core relation, and how imperialism was about the domination of central advanced Western states over peripheral states such as Iran. So for them, the main contradiction was imperialism, anti-imperialism, and therefore anything which would undermine anti-imperialism of an existing state would be problematic. So Kurdish nationalism was problematic if it went independent, because it would undermine Iran as a pre-existing state, which is in post-revolutionary period was opposing imperialism. So there was always this different forms of greater good kind of argument. The other, I guess, reason for the difference might be, all these wars which have happened in the recent decades, war on terror, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and so on and so forth, and the way in which this, Syrianization theory of the Iranian state against opposition to itself somehow being internalized even by its own leftist opposition. So I think, this idea of Balkanization is basically that, and it neglects the fact that actually Iran is already Balkanized. If you are a Baluch or a Kurd, you are experiencing the same level of repression and destruction. So it's not that preserving the status quo is preventing, great violence. The violence is already being committed against different nations, which stateless nations within Iran. But I must say that myself haven't properly researched organized Iranian left positions during that period, except for that case which I refer to, that book chapter, but also my own observation in 1980s when leftist groups were present in Kurdistan. And what is fascinating is that, as I said, they came to Kurdistan as the last trench of the revolution, and then they were helped by the Kurdish groups to migrate to Europe. And many of those very people who supported the Kurdish movement then, and they owe their life actually to Kurdish movement, are now actually openly opposing Kurdish movement. And I have encountered them, in fact, have debated with them. So it's, I think it's great. It's a tragedy, I would say, because the principled position of the Iranian left at the time is very different from what we see. Not from every Iranian leftist person. And definitely Sharara is right that feminist movement in Iran, especially leftist feminist movement, is the most, I think, principled and reliable, actually, support for Kurdish movement and other subaltern nations movement in Iran, because in many ways, actually, the national question in Iran is similar to the gender question, right? If you don't recognize the autonomy and independence of the woman or, the minoritized sexual or gender groups, how can you actually organize a democratic association? You can't. You have to begin from recognizing their separate, independent existence. Then you can actually talk about a common struggle. So, sorry, I went off track, but basically, yeah, I think there are reasons why this position in the left, of the left, has changed compared to then as opposed to now.
Sorry, I have to go faster, but I really believe that the Iranian women showed that in Women Life Freedom Movement that they can be natural ally to Kurd and Baluchistan, and it goes both ways, or triple ways, or fourth ways. The next question, I just want to share, because Mr. Turaj's comment is or question is next, but I just want to explain, maybe for those of you who don't see what I'm doing here, is that I'm just reading from the top of the list. I don't know what's next, so I'm not censoring anybody. I don't know any of these names, so I'm just going by the list. So the next one is from iPhone, so no name. Thank you for your thought-provocative discussion. Could you elaborate on the dual relationship in Marxism compared to your perspective on the triple relationship inherent in your proposed solution? If I may, so I read Turaj's comment.
Please, let's do two questions at a time so we can...
Okay. Okay. Turaj says, with all respect, I don't think so. It is not possible because post-Iranian modernity intellectuals even left maybe one deeply involved with fake nationalists of pure Aryan race and Cyrus King, as we see every daily life. My second question is, Kurdish people can take different paths instead of taking gun against any government. Historical perspectives prove it would not work. Therefore, what Azerbaijan movement is probably better solution than starting to killing people. Non-obedience in a civil society and asking for national identity Kurds, Turks, and Baluch, Arab, etc. And there's another comment from Turaj. Let me finish with that. Intersectionality is the best solution. This is all Turaj, the second part.
Yeah, I start from Turaj and then to the iPhone question about double relationship. I'm not sure actually it's true that all of Iranian leftists are, Aryanists. It's not true. I mean, if you look at, for example, Alireza Nabdel's writings before revolution, one of the prominent members of Cherikay Fadai Khalq, he very openly talks about Persian chauvinism and he supports Kurdish movement. Actually, early members of Cherikay Fadai Khalq had very close relation to Soleiman Moini and Ismail Sharifzadeh and others within the Kurdish movement at the time. Members of the Sazman Enqelabi Hezb Tude actually in 1960s and 70s came from Europe to Kurdistan and actually even picked up arms and fought alongside the Kurdish Peshmergas and so on. So there is actually a history of Iranian leftists being much more in solidarity with the Kurdish movement, notwithstanding the issues about the meaning of national self-determination and what they understood by it. It's a pity that we don't see that kind of solidarity now. In terms of civil disobedience, I think the form of struggle obviously is historical itself. I think the armed struggle was not method of choice for the Kurds. It was a very particular historical situation which sort of made it possible or even necessary. But that's a different debate. Double relationship, basically, if you read the German ideology, which is a key Marxist text, one of the early works of Marx and Engels, basically in the German ideology, Marx and Engels introduce historical materialism as a social theory, right? Mm-hmm. So for them, everything to do with social world is historical, i.e. it comes about at a particular time and it changes over time. This historicality is important because it opposes the idea that capitalism is a natural thing and therefore cannot be overcome. It historicizes capitalism so that it becomes possible in theory to go beyond it and have something else. It is materialist to the extent that says historical change is driven through material change. So that's what really historical materialism is about. And again, because they were formulating their theory in opposition to Hegel, they were trying to emphasize the materialism as opposed to idealism of it. But double relationship is therefore the way in which they claim that historical materialism can be applied practically to any question. So the argument is that human beings have to produce in order to live. If you don't eat, you will die after a month, right? So that's the most fundamental fact of social life. Production is the base, as they would say. Now, how you produce? In order to produce, you have to engage with nature. Yeah, you have to do agriculture. You plant grain. You harvest the wheat, and then you make flour, and then bread, and so on and so forth. So there is always engagement with nature. So that's one relation of human beings to the nature, right? But human beings are always act collectively when they deal with nature. So they have to form relation among themselves in order to engage with nature. So that's the second relation. Human beings relate to each other through, for example, relations of slavery. You know, slavery is a form of collective relations. A master owns a slave, and together they engage with nature by exploiting the slave, or feudal relation, or capitalist relations. So production is always a social phenomenon. And therefore, for Marx and Engels, if you want to understand a society, you have to look at these two relations with nature and relations between and among the members of that society itself, which is engaging with nature. My triple relationship says that basically these two relations are fundamental, but there is a third relation, which is that at any given time in history, there is always more than one society. So yes, human beings associate with each other to engage with nature, but those associations themselves are multiple and plural. And therefore they come into relation with each other as well. So there is a set of inter-societal relations, right? So let's, I don't know, take Safavid state, you know. Safavid state is a formation. It engages with, you know, nature within its political remit, but at the same time, it also engages with Ottoman Empire, with the Russians, with the Georgians, and so on. So war actually is one element of that social reproduction itself. So there is always an external dimension to any society's natural reproduction. And that is what classical Marxism really does not recognize. And if you read my book, you know, there are references, specific references where, you know, Marx, for example, in Capital in Volume 1, there is a footnote on page, I don't know, 6 to 5, which says, for the sake of argument, we conceive of the world market as a single unit. So basically says it doesn't matter if there are 50 empires and, I don't know, 200 states or whatever. These are all secondary. We are just focusing as if it's a one single unit. And my argument is that those pluralities are actually fundamentally important. You know, Reza Khan's modernization would have no meaning if it did not feel that it was under threat by the Russians or the British. The defeats by the Russians in Turkmenchai and Golestan were fundamental in Iranian modernism and the Iranian nationalist movement, because they wanted to prevent a repetition of that kind of defeat and subjugation. So the reproduction of Iranian empire or state was conditioned by the way in which it was relating to other states. So interstate relation is not something less important or separate from social reproduction. It's always already there. Just look at Iran's nuclear project. If Iran wasn't afraid of regime change, it would not do nuclear project. If it didn't do nuclear project, it would not impose these harsh conditions of Iranian society. It wouldn't create a, you know, corrupt oligarchy within IRGC. Iran's entire political economy has changed because of Iran's adversity with the United States. So Iran's social reproduction as a state is entirely shaped by its international relations. So we can't not have international relations in the fundamental theory of social reproduction. If you are a good Marxist, that's what I'm trying to kind of say, that triple relationship is referring to this intersocietal dimension of social life.
Thank you. Let me read this next question, which is in Farsi, anonymous. In Kurdish, I hope I can do justice. Zubar Sepas Kak Dr. I'm so sorry. Hukaris.
You can actually copy paste it if you want me to see it.
Sure, because definitely cannot do the justice. So I'm going to send it to, post it on chat.
So the question is هۆکاری سەرەکی هەڵەتێگەیشتنی چەپی کورد لە چەپ و بیرکردنەوەیان وەک چەپی ئێرانی کە لە ڕاستیدا چەپی داگیرکەرە چییە؟ The question, I put it in English, I guess everybody understand. What is the primary reason for Kurdish left misunderstanding of Iranian left, which is a occupational left, a left which is associated with the state which is occupying basically Kurdistan. That's what I understand to be saying. I think not all of the Kurdish left is having those misunderstanding, but I think it's ultimately to do with those problems in Marx and Marxism I discussed. Unfortunately, the left in general and Kurdish left in particular has very little serious theoretical engagement with the classics, and they are not really following developments in Marxist thought elsewhere in the world. So if you don't mind, I will also respond quickly in Kurdish since the question was in Kurdish.
Definitely.
زۆر سپاس بۆ پرسیارە. وەڵامی من ئەوەیە کە ئەوڵەن هەموو چەپی کورد ئەوانیە هەر لە ڕۆژهەڵاتی کوردستان جیاوازی زۆر هەیە بینی بڵین کۆمەڵی حیزبی کۆمونیستی ئێران کە سەید براهیمی عەلیزادەوانن لەگەڵ بۆ وێنە لایەنەکەی تر کە لەگەڵ سەلاحی مازووجی زۆر دەناسرێنەوە، یا مەسەلەن کوردەکانی ناو حکمەتیستەکان لەگەڵ ئەوانی تر. بۆیە چەپێکی یەکسانمان نییە لە ڕۆژهەڵاتی کوردستانە لە باقی شوێنەکان. بەڵام ئەگەریش کەم و کوڕێک هەبێ لە خراپتێگەشتنی وانە چەپی ئێرانی بە بڕوای من دەگەڕێتەوە سەر ئەو کێشانەی لە ناخودی تێۆری مارکسیستی هەیە کە من لەو قسەباسی ئەوڕۆدا باسم کرد، و ئەوەی کە چەپی ڕۆژهەڵاتی ناوەڕاست بە گشتی و چەپی کورد بە تایبەتی کاری تئۆریک بە شتێکی لاوەکی دەزانن و زۆر لەگەڵ دەقەکانی کلاسیکی مارکسیستی هەڵسوکەوت ناکەن و نانویستۆکە لەگەڵ یان نیانتوانیوە لەگەڵ ڕەوتی بەرەو پێشچوونی بیری مارکسیستی، بیری ڕەخنەگرانەی مارکسیستی لە ئەوروپای لە شوێنەکانی تری دنیا بەئیسلاح بچنە پێشەوە ئاگاداریان بن. زۆر سپاس. Thank you. So I responded.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Dr. Matin, since we're very limited in time, like a few 3 minutes left, we were hoping to finish at 1, but if you go a little bit over, it's okay, but just...
I have to also obviously go. I mean, maybe 5 minutes from most.
Yeah, 5 minutes from now, Max. And if you let me read everything, and then you take a note.
I can be selective. Yeah, you can read everything, and I respond.
So I'm going to read anonymous question. Iran is a fake country that British created to us, and pure Aryan race, descendant of Cyrus King, is a fake identity. What is the most possible future of the Middle East in a multipolar world system? So these are all coming from one person, anonymous. The next is, do you support the idea of having one national language, زبان دیوانی, in the Iran, while also ensuring that the rights of all other languages are preserved? Nora asked that question. And Mehdi asked this question, Farsi. با سپاس از سخنرانی دکتر متین، دو پرسش. نظر شما در مورد فدرالیسم در آینده ایران چیست؟ و در رابطه با پرسش نخست، نقش روابط بین المللی در عروج اسلام سیاسی فاندامنتالیست را در رابطه با مسئله ملل یا خلقها یا اقوام در ایران و خاورمیانه چگونه ارزیابی میکنید؟ این سوال آقای مهدی. comment دادن آقای anonymous, another anonymous. You pointed to Russia war. What is your answer to realist Mearsheimer, which says that the war was provoked by NATO expansion? Okay. Another question from Turaj again. Whatever Dr. Matin is saying, absolutely true. Left always has revealed and supported the issue of rights of women and ethnicity within Iranian society, I'm talking about current left, people like Abbas Milani. It's just a comment. And the last one is, again, from Anonymous. What is your perspective about Dr. Pezeshkian? Dr. Pezeshkian, can he do something about decreasing of pressure to women and having permission to non-Persian to be able to read while and develop and write and develop their own language in the schools? So these were all questions. So we close on question. And
thank you. I quickly address them. Iran is a fake country. Well, every country is fake because when you say something is historical, it means it didn't exist and it was constructed. So something being faked presupposes there is something which is genuine, and I don't think there is such a thing. Every nation is historically constituted and can change and didn't exist before. So that doesn't mean that these nations or states are not real, because they have a real effect on people which they dominate. So I think the main task is to understand why these states have emerged in a way that they are based on cultural hierarchies rather than kind of equality. And that's where I think the social theory is important, and my own work is trying to understand why nation states have historically assumed this centralized hierarchical form rather than, even pre-modern empires actually in some ways more democratic because they were all decentralized, largely because the technology was not allowing direct control from the center. Someone in Isfahan could never control Sanandaj. They had to actually rely on Ardalan, principality to come into some sort of alliance or whatever. So every area actually was running itself, which is why actually, in the period of Iranian nation state formation, these Molukut Tawayefi became a word of abuse, as if it's as a fundamentally regressive, problematic thing. But what it actually refers to, it's a problematic only because they were comparing it with a central state, which is France. France was the model for many of these countries, especially for Turkey. So centralization of state, therefore, saw pre-existing local governments as a problem. And because they were a problem, they had to normatively denigrate them. They would describe them as backward, as regressive, and so on and so forth. So I hope, and the future for the region, you ask Anonymous, I think a plural democratic arrangement is the only way these, the national problems can be solved. And the beginning for it is the recognition of difference rather than unity. The more you say we are all the same, the more you produce national question, because we are not the same, and that unsameness has to be the principle, not the destination. Whether I agree with one national language, no, I don't. I think historically one language, one nation, one flag has been the emblem, the symbol of these hierarchical nation states. There is no technological or political or administrative problems for having multiple languages, right? I have been to European Union conferences. There are 12 different languages spoken. There is no problem. In South Africa, there is 36 languages, all of which are formal, officially recognized. Because people forget that most people, 95% of people in Iran, they interact on a daily basis, not with someone 1,000 kilometers away. They interact with their own locality. So the number of times they would interact with someone who does not speak their own language is extremely limited. And in day and age, we all speak multiple languages, European languages. What's the problem with multiple languages? At least I think at the early stage, this multiplicity should be recognized, right? But in the future, when we have a democratic arrangement of these different nations, they might democratically agree on some languages to become bureaucratic languages, but that should not be imposed from beginning, from outside, from outset. On whether the federalism in the general sense of decentralization, but I don't agree with a federalism which simply allocates certain administrative roles to this and that province or ethnicity. But in terms of federalism being a non-centralized form of state, yes, that's the basis. But how it's organized within it, I think it's another question. Personally, I'm in favor of communal form of governance based on small-scale communes, basically, which then come together to form larger units. Quite similar to what democratic confederalist system in Syria, Rojava, is trying to do. In terms of international relations impact on political Islam, I have an article which has been translated and published in Naqd Iqtisad Siyasi. I refer Mehdi to that article because I really can't go through it. But the short answer is that international relations was absolutely fundamental to the rise of political Islam, but not in the usual sense of, Americans helped Khomeini because he was anti-Soviet. That was true, but international relations was fundamental to Iranian modernity in a much, much deeper way, which I have explained in that article. What I say about Mearsheimer, NATO expansion, I don't entirely agree. I think there is something to be said about NATO expansionism, but I think Russia as a state has an imperial mindset, and the moment Ukraine in 2014 had that so-called Maidan revolution and a pro-Russian president was removed, Russia was bent on actually undermining and annexing Ukraine. So I think to the extent that Ukrainian nation does exist and wants to exercise his national sovereignty, he has every right to do so. And in that sense, I find Russian war a very typical imperial war, actually, because I just don't see why NATO want to take over Russia. I mean, Russia is a capitalist state. And I mean, China, okay, economically is a rival because it's so advanced. Russia has nothing other than oil. I mean, and the world is going towards non-fossil energy anyway. So I think a lot of these threats are manufactured and they are not really real in terms of the danger. True. That comment by Turaj, I forgot what the comment is, but it's not a question anyway. Pezeshkian can do anything. No, I don't think he can. I mean, who can do anything in the Islamic Republic? I mean, it's Velayat al-Faqih, and it's very clear. I mean, Islamic Republic is really based, its identity is based on negation of women's rights. It will be something else. It will be metamorphosing into something else if it stopped doing so. So I don't think Pezeshkian can, even if he wanted, but I don't think even if he wants to, because you just look at his pronouncement. He is as misogynistic and as reactionary as anyone else in the Islamic Republic anyways. So no, I don't have any illusion about Pezeshkian. So thank you. I think that concludes.
You did an excellent job. Thank you for accepting our invitation and presenting such a thought-provocative discussion. I think the number of questions and that the fact that we ran out of time shows that how important this topic is and how much we all need to discuss this even further. So I really hope that we can invite you again and continue this discussion. And I thank everyone who participated and be patient with their questions. And I really looking forward to future questions. Thank you, Dr. Matin.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you, everyone, to be here. So we end this talk now.
Good night. Bye.